Risk has a strange relationship with memory. When something fails, the risk feels obvious. People remember the warnings, the doubts, the voices that hesitated. Failure preserves uncertainty because it needs an explanation. When something works, the risk tends to vanish. Success rewrites the story backward. Decisions that once felt fragile are remembered as foresight. Doubt becomes caution that was wisely managed. What was once debated becomes inevitable. The Mustang lives inside that distortion. Today, it is difficult to remember how unnecessary it once seemed, how exposed it looked. How many sensible people inside Ford believed it was the wrong move at the wrong time? Not because it was badly designed, not because it was obviously flawed, but because it violated a rule Ford had learned to trust. It took a risk that did not need to be taken. Ford was not failing when the Mustang was approved. It was not losing money. It was not under immediate threat. The company was doing what it had always done reasonably well. That made the decision harder to justify, not easier. Risk is easiest to defend when the alternative is collapse. It is much harder to defend when the alternative is stability. From the inside, the Mustang did not look bold. It looked indulgent. It looked like a distraction from disciplined progress. It asked the company to prioritize feeling over certainty and speed over assurance. Those choices make people uncomfortable, especially when the existing system is still working. There were safer ways to proceed, smarter ways depending on how you define smart. Ford could have adjusted its lineup incrementally. It could have refined what it already sold. It could have addressed younger buyers without challenging internal norms. Those options looked responsible. The Mustang did not. And that is what makes this episode different. Because the question is not whether the Mustang was risky. That is obvious. The question is why the risk stopped being remembered as risk once it worked. Inside Ford, skepticism did not disappear the moment sales numbers came in. Early success created confusion more than confidence. People argued about whether demand was durable or fleeting, whether the car represented a shift or a spike. For a time, the Mustang existed in an uncomfortable space between failure and validation. That is where risk lives longest. But history rarely preserves that space. It prefers clean arcs, clear lessons, stories where boldness is rewarded and caution looks foolish in retrospect. That is not how it felt in the moment. This episode is about that moment, about how the Mustang was viewed before it worked, while it was working, and after success began to erase the memory of uncertainty. It is about the danger of forgetting why a decision was difficult in the first place. Because when risk disappears from the story, something important goes with it. Organizations that forget what made a decision risky often learn the wrong lesson from success. They confuse outcome with insight. They assume that what worked once can be repeated safely. Ford nearly did that. The Mustang did not prove that risk was harmless. It proved that some risks only look sensible after the fact. Understanding that difference matters, because the next time a company faces a similar choice, history will not remind it how unsure it once was. It will remind it only that the gamble paid off. And that is where the real danger begins. To understand how that happened, we have to return to the moment before the Mustang worked, to when the risk still looked like a mistake waiting to happen. Part 1. The risk that looked irresponsible. Before the Mustang became a success story, it was a liability with a timetable. Inside Ford, the risk was not framed as boldness. It was framed as exposure. The project asked the company to attach its name to something that could fail in ways that were difficult to contain. This was not abstract. If the Mustang underperformed, it would not quietly miss a sales target. It would publicly contradict the company's judgment. It would invite questions about leadership priorities. It would suggest that Ford had misread its market at a moment when misreading the market carried reputational weight. That kind of risk feels different from technical risk. Technical failures can be corrected. Designs can be revised. Components can be strengthened. Those problems live inside engineering and manufacturing systems designed to absorb them. Reputational risk does not behave that way. Once it surfaces, it spreads. It reshapes how future decisions are interpreted. It follows the people who approved it. From that vantage point, the Mustang looked irresponsible, not because it was careless, but because it was unnecessary. Ford already had a full lineup. It already covered price points and use cases. It already knew how to sell cars to families, fleets, and loyal repeat buyers. The Mustang did not fill an obvious gap. It created a new one. And creating a new category inside a stable organization is often seen as indulgence rather than strategy. There was also concern about who would be blamed if things went wrong. Projects like the Mustang do not fail anonymously. They become associated with advocates, with champions, with individuals whose judgment can be questioned in hindsight. That reality shapes behavior. When a proposal carries asymmetric risk, people become cautious not because they lack conviction, but because they understand how memory works inside institutions. Failures are remembered with names attached. Successes are remembered as collective achievements. The Mustang threatened that balance. There was also a deeper discomfort at play. The project depended on an assumption Ford was not used to making explicitly, that buyers would act on feeling rather than logic. That design cues and identity signals could outweigh practical considerations. This was not how Ford had built its reputation. The company trusted measurable needs, capacity, reliability, cost, longevity. Those factors could be engineered, tested, and defended. Emotion could not. From inside the organization, building a car around emotion felt like surrendering control. It meant accepting that the market might respond in ways that could not be forecast cleanly. That loss of control was unsettling, especially when the existing system was delivering predictable results. There were also fears about internal signaling. Approving the Mustang would communicate that exceptions could be made, that established rules could be bent, that speed might outrank completeness. Those messages do not stop with one project. Leaders worried about precedent, about what future teams might justify by pointing to the Mustang, about how standards might erode if this gamble were rewarded. That concern was not theoretical. Large organizations rely on shared expectations to function. When those expectations shift suddenly, alignment can fracture. From this perspective, the Mustang looked less like innovation and more like a crack in discipline. The safer alternative, by contrast, reaffirmed norms. It rewarded patience. It reinforced the idea that progress should be incremental and controlled. That made it easier to support. It also made the Mustang easier to criticize. Critics did not have to argue that the Mustang was bad. They only had to argue that it was unnecessary. That is a powerful position. Unnecessary risk is difficult to justify, especially when the downside is visible and the upside is speculative. Inside Ford, that logic carried weight. Meetings reflected it. Language softened around the Mustang. Concerns were phrased carefully, but persistently. Questions were raised about timing, scope, and responsibility. No one wanted to stop the project outright, but many wanted it to slow down, to become more conventional, to fit better within established boundaries. Those impulses were framed as prudence, and prudence is hard to argue against. What made the situation unstable was that prudence alone could not answer one lingering question. If the Mustang was unnecessary, why did it keep resurfacing? Why did the idea refuse to settle? That tension did not resolve cleanly. It accumulated, because beneath the argument about risk sat a quieter unease, a sense that doing nothing bold might be riskier than it appeared. But that unease had not yet found a voice. And until it did, the Mustang would continue to look like a mistake waiting to happen. Part 2. Why sensible people expected it to fail. Skepticism about the Mustang did not come from narrow thinking. It came from experience. Inside Ford, many of the people questioning the project had lived through cycles of enthusiasm before. They had seen ideas that looked promising in early focus groups collapse under real-world use. They had watched youth-oriented products spike briefly and then disappear once novelty wore off. Those memories mattered. The auto industry had a long record of cars designed for younger buyers that failed quietly. Some were too expensive to sustain demand. Others promised performance they could not reliably deliver. Many underestimated how quickly taste shifted once a new model became familiar. From that history, a pattern emerged. Youth appeal was volatile. Image-driven demand was fragile. Emotion was not a foundation you could build forecasts on. The Mustang sat squarely inside that risk profile. Its appeal was not rooted in a clear functional advantage. It was not cheaper than everything else. It was not faster in every configuration. It did not introduce a new technology that competitors could not match. What it offered was a feeling. From a planning perspective, that made it hard to trust. Market research could indicate interest, but interest does not always convert to sustained sales. Early enthusiasm often reflects curiosity rather than commitment. That distinction mattered to people responsible for long-term volume. There were also concerns about substitution rather than expansion. If the Mustang sold well, who would it sell to? Would it attract entirely new buyers? Or would it simply pull customers away from other Ford models? If it cannibalized existing sales rather than growing the base, the net benefit would be smaller than headlines suggested. That scenario was plausible. Many inside Ford believed younger buyers would eventually buy practical cars anyway. The Mustang might simply accelerate a purchase that would have happened regardless, without creating lasting loyalty. In that case, the company would have taken on risk without expanding its reach. Engineering skepticism reinforced this view. The compromises built into the platform meant the Mustang's performance envelope was narrow. It could feel exciting within certain limits, but those limits would be tested as owners pushed the car harder. If expectations outpaced reality, disappointment would follow. Disappointment spreads faster than enthusiasm. Engineers understood how quickly perception could turn once handling limitations or durability issues became visible. A few widely shared stories could shift the narrative from exciting to irresponsible. That possibility weighed heavily. There was also concern about sustainability. Even if the Mustang launched successfully, could it evolve without losing its appeal? Youth-focused products often struggle with aging. What feels fresh one year can feel dated the next. Would Ford be forced into constant reinvention to keep the car relevant? Would that pace be sustainable inside a company built on longer product cycles? Those questions did not have reassuring answers. From this vantage point, expecting failure was not pessimism, it was pattern recognition. People were not arguing that the Mustang would collapse immediately. They were arguing that it would struggle to maintain relevance once the initial excitement faded. That belief shaped how early signals were interpreted. Positive indicators were discounted as novelty effects. Strong early interest was seen as curiosity rather than commitment. Skepticism persisted even as evidence accumulated. This is a common organizational response to uncertainty. When outcomes do not align with expectations, institutions often question the data rather than revise the model. Especially when revising the model would require admitting that established assumptions might no longer apply. Inside Ford, the assumption was that stability would eventually reassert itself. The market would calm, buyers would return to practical considerations, the Mustang would settle into a niche or fade. That outcome felt reasonable. It also felt safe to assume. Believing the Mustang would fail allowed skeptics to maintain confidence in the systems they trusted. It preserved continuity. It avoided the need to rethink how demand was generated. This is not a flaw unique to Ford. Organizations are built to rely on what has worked before. They treat deviations as temporary unless proven otherwise. The Mustang had not yet proven otherwise, and until it did, expecting failure was not only sensible, it was rational. The real surprise was not that people doubted the Mustang. It was how long that doubt persisted even after the car began to succeed. Because success that does not fit existing explanations rarely feels like validation. It feels like an anomaly. And anomalies are easier to dismiss than to understand. That dynamic would define the Mustang's early life. The car was selling. The risk was unfolding, and yet belief lagged behind reality. Which is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the moment success begins is not the moment doubt disappears. It is often the moment doubt becomes harder to articulate. And that is when organizations start making their most interesting mistakes. Part 3. The early signals that confused everyone. When the Mustang began to sell, it did not resolve the debate inside Ford, it unsettled it. Early demand arrived quickly, but not cleanly. Orders surged in some regions and lagged in others. Dealerships reported crowds, but not always conversions. Phone calls spiked, foot traffic increased, deposits appeared before test drives. None of that fit comfortably into existing models. From a distance, it looked like success. From inside the company, it looked uneven. Executives asked familiar questions. Was this sustained demand or launch noise? Were buyers committing or simply reacting to novelty? Would this interest survive once the car was no longer new? The data did not answer those questions decisively. Early sales numbers are seductive, but they are also misleading. They capture momentum, not durability. Ford knew this. It had seen strong launches before that flattened once curiosity faded. So the Mustang's early performance was treated cautiously. Reports were read with qualifiers. Growth was acknowledged, then hedged. Internal conversations emphasized the need for patience before drawing conclusions. This caution created an odd dynamic. On the outside, the Mustang was becoming a story. On the inside, it was becoming a puzzle. Dealers described customers who had not planned to buy a Ford. Younger buyers, first-time buyers, people who asked fewer practical questions and made faster decisions. Those anecdotes mattered, but they were hard to aggregate. Anecdotes do not scale well in organizations trained to trust spreadsheets. At the same time, some familiar warning signs appeared. Certain trims lagged expectations. Some buyers pushed the car harder than anticipated and reported limitations. Insurance concerns surfaced quickly. Enthusiasts began comparing the Mustang to cars it was never intended to compete with. Those signals reinforced skepticism. To critics, they suggested fragility beneath the excitement. To advocates, they looked like the growing pains of something new. The same data supported two opposing interpretations. That ambiguity is uncomfortable. Organizations prefer clarity, even when clarity is bad news. Ambiguity keeps debates alive. Inside Ford, meetings reflected that tension. Success was acknowledged without celebration. Concerns were voiced without escalation. The Mustang occupied an in-between status. It was not failing. It was not yet trusted. That status slowed internal recalibration. Budgets were adjusted conservatively. Long-term plans were deferred. Decisions about expansion, investment, and positioning were made cautiously. No one wanted to bet fully on a signal they did not yet understand. This caution extended to language. Internal communications avoided definitive claims. The Mustang was described as promising, interesting, worth monitoring, rarely as transformational. That restraint mattered. Language shapes belief. Belief shapes behavior. By refusing to name the Mustang a success too early, Ford preserved flexibility. It also delayed commitment. From one perspective, that delay was prudent. From another, it was revealing. It showed how difficult it is for large organizations to recognize shifts in real time. Even when evidence accumulates, belief lags behind, especially when the evidence challenges foundational assumptions. The Mustang challenged Ford's understanding of how demand was created. It suggested that buyers could be motivated by identity as much as utility, that they would act quickly when something resonated emotionally. Those ideas conflicted with models built on rational choice and gradual decision-making. Accepting them required more than data. It required reframing how the company understood its customers. That reframing did not happen overnight. Instead, Ford lived in a period of suspended judgment. Sales continued. Debate continued. The car performed better than expected without fully convincing everyone. This period is often erased in hindsight. History prefers clean arcs. It jumps from decision to success and skips the messy middle where belief has not yet caught up to reality. But it is in that middle that risk actually plays out. The Mustang was no longer a hypothetical gamble. It was a real product generating real outcomes. And yet, it still felt provisional. That provisional feeling shaped subsequent choices. It influenced how aggressively Ford responded to demand. It affected how the car was positioned publicly and internally. Success had arrived. Certainty had not. That gap would not last forever. But before it closed, something subtle began to happen. As sales numbers grew, the risk that once dominated conversations began to feel smaller, not because it had disappeared, but because it was being quietly reinterpreted. And that reinterpretation would matter as much as the original decision, because once risk starts to shrink in memory, it stops being treated as risk at all. It becomes precedent, and precedent is far more powerful than doubt. Part 4. When the risk started looking smaller than it was. the shift did not happen all at once. There was no meeting where someone declared the risk gone. No memo announcing that uncertainty had been resolved. Instead, the Mustang's success began to change how people talked about it, sentence by sentence, report by report. Language softened. What had once been described as exposure became described as opportunity. Concerns were reframed as manageable challenges. Qualifiers quietly disappeared from summaries and presentations. The risk did not vanish. It was edited out. As sales accelerated, internal narratives adjusted to keep pace. Forecasts were revised upward. Production discussions shifted from caution to capacity. Questions about whether the Mustang should exist gave way to questions about how quickly it could scale. Those changes felt natural. Organizations are good at adapting once a direction appears validated. They reward alignment. They discourage lingering doubt. What they are less good at is preserving memory. As confidence grew, earlier skepticism began to look unnecessary in retrospect. People remembered the concerns, but they remembered them as overcautious rather than prudent. That reinterpretation was subtle, but consequential. The Mustang had not become less risky. The conditions that made it fragile still existed. Platform constraints remained. Insurance scrutiny intensified. Expectations continued to rise. What changed was perception. Risk felt smaller because it had not yet materialized as failure. That is an easy mistake to make. Absence of failure is not proof of safety. It is simply the absence of evidence so far. But success has a way of compressing timelines. Early wins are extrapolated forward. Momentum is mistaken for stability. Inside Ford, this dynamic showed up in planning assumptions. The Mustang's performance was increasingly treated as durable rather than emergent. Early demand was interpreted as a reliable signal rather than a transient surge. Scenarios that once felt speculative began to feel predictive. Those shifts affected decision-making. Investments were justified using the Mustang as evidence that Ford had figured it out. The car became a reference point in conversations about future products, marketing strategies, and risk tolerance. This is where success starts doing more than generating revenue. It starts shaping identity. The Mustang was no longer just a car that had worked. It was a story about how Ford worked, about its ability to read the market, about its willingness to take calculated risks. That story did not include much room for doubt. Internal skepticism, once visible, became less welcome. Questioning the Mustang's long-term implications began to sound like resistance rather than responsibility. People still had concerns. They simply learned to phrase them differently or keep them to themselves. This is not unique to Ford. Organizations often respond to success by narrowing acceptable interpretations. Once a narrative gains traction, alternative readings feel disruptive. The Mustang narrative was consolidating. It said that Ford had trusted its instincts and been rewarded, that it had moved decisively and been proven right. That framing made sense. It also simplified reality. The truth was more complex. The Mustang succeeded under specific conditions, within specific constraints, during a particular cultural moment. Its success did not invalidate the risks that had been identified earlier. But complexity does not travel well. Success stories are smoother when friction is removed. As the Mustang's image solidified, earlier debates faded from institutional memory. The arguments that had once stalled meetings were no longer revisited. The conservative alternative was rarely mentioned, not because it had been wrong, but because it no longer mattered. The risk that once dominated discussions had become background noise. It existed only as a faint echo in older documents and the memories of people who had moved on. What remained was a cleaner story, a story where the Mustang made sense, where the decision felt inevitable, where the risk had always been manageable. This is the moment when organizations are most vulnerable, not because they are failing, but because they are learning the wrong lesson from success. When risk looks smaller than it was, it stops being treated with respect. It becomes something to be repeated rather than something to be understood. Ford was not immune to that temptation. The Mustang had worked, and because it had worked, the conditions that made it risky began to feel irrelevant. That belief would shape what came next. Because once risk becomes invisible, it does not disappear. It waits, and often returns when the context has changed and the margins for error are thinner. The Mustang was entering that phase. And Ford was about to discover that forgetting why something was risky can be just as dangerous as taking the risk in the first place. Part 5. The danger of forgetting why it was risky. The most dangerous moment in any successful project is not the launch. It is the moment when the risk that shaped the decision disappears from memory. Once the Mustang began to feel proven, Ford faced a new problem. Not uncertainty, but confidence. And confidence, when detached from context, can be misleading. The original risk had been specific. It was tied to timing, culture, platform constraints, and buyer psychology. It existed because the outcome depended on variables that could not be fully controlled. Those variables had not gone away, but they no longer felt urgent. As the Mustang's success became part of the company's identity, the decision that created it was simplified. The nuance that made it difficult was stripped out. What remained was a clean lesson: boldness pays off. That lesson was incomplete. Boldness had paid off once, under particular conditions, with careful boundaries and a willingness to accept imperfection. Treating that outcome as a general rule invited overreach. Inside Ford, this tension surfaced quietly. Future proposals began referencing the Mustang as precedent. Teams pointed to it when arguing for faster timelines, looser constraints, or greater emphasis on image. The implication was clear. We have done this before. We know how this works. That belief was comforting. It was also risky, because the Mustang's success did not mean Ford had discovered a formula. It meant the company had navigated a specific moment effectively. Confusing those two things is how organizations overextend. There were early signs of this misinterpretation. Projects that lacked the Mustang's cultural tailwinds were framed as similarly transformative. Assumptions about buyer behavior hardened into expectations. Risk tolerance increased without a corresponding increase in scrutiny. The company was not being reckless. It was being selective in what it remembered. The doubts that had once slowed the Mustang's approval were no longer present to slow future decisions. Skepticism was treated as something to overcome rather than something to preserve. That shift changed internal dynamics. Voices that had raised concerns during the Mustang's early days found less traction later. The narrative had moved on. The organization wanted momentum, not reminders of fragility. This is how success can distort learning. Instead of asking why a risk worked, organizations often ask how to repeat it. They focus on visible actions rather than invisible conditions. Ford risked doing the same. The Mustang's success depended on restraint as much as boldness, on not overpromising, on managing expectations, on evolving gradually rather than declaring victory too soon. Those elements are harder to celebrate. They do not fit neatly into origin stories. As the Mustang became iconic, its early uncertainty was replaced by confidence retroactively assigned. The risk that once felt excessive was reframed as foresight. That reframing had consequences. It encouraged the belief that Ford had been right all along, that the market had been predictable, that intuition had replaced doubt. In reality, the Mustang had worked because Ford had been willing to live with ambiguity and adjust in response to real signals. Forgetting that made future ambiguity feel unnecessary. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. Organizations are not designed to remember uncertainty. They are designed to stabilize around outcomes. But when uncertainty is erased from memory, organizations lose their ability to recognize it when it returns. The Mustang's success created confidence. The danger was allowing that confidence to harden into doctrine. Because once a story becomes doctrine, it stops being questioned. And when it stops being questioned, it stops being useful. Ford was still benefiting from the Mustang, but the lesson it took from that success would matter just as much as the car itself. Whether the company remembered the risk honestly or only the reward would shape what it did next. And that choice would determine whether the Mustang remained an exception or became a misunderstanding. Part 6. When the risk became the baseline. At some point, the Mustang stopped being an exception inside Ford. It became a reference. What had once required special justification began to feel normal. Timelines that would have raised concerns before were now described as ambitious but achievable. Marketing language that once felt risky became familiar. The balance between image and substance shifted subtly, without a formal decision ever being made. This is how culture changes in large organizations, not through declarations, but through defaults. The Mustang reset those defaults. Future projects were no longer evaluated against Ford's historical comfort zone alone. They were measured against what the Mustang had accomplished. The question was no longer whether a risk was appropriate, but whether it resembled a risk that had already paid off. That distinction matters. The Mustang's success created a new baseline for what felt acceptable. Choices that once would have triggered extensive debate moved forward with less resistance. The memory of uncertainty faded, replaced by confidence in the organization's instincts. This shift had benefits. Ford became more willing to experiment. Teams felt empowered to propose ideas that might previously have stalled. The company demonstrated an ability to respond to cultural signals rather than waiting for them to become undeniable. That adaptability mattered in a changing market, but there was also pressure embedded in the new baseline. When success becomes the standard, repetition is expected. What worked once is assumed to be replicable. Each new project carries an implicit comparison to the last success story. The Mustang raised expectations that were difficult to sustain universally. Not every product could carry the same cultural weight. Not every gamble would land in the same way. Yet the internal appetite for risk had increased, even as the conditions that made the Mustang successful remained specific. This created tension. Some teams felt compelled to frame their proposals in Mustang-like terms, emphasizing boldness and emotional appeal, even when those qualities were not central to the product's value. Others worried that caution was becoming unfashionable. Risk, once tolerated selectively, began to feel like an expectation. That is a subtle but important shift. When risk becomes a baseline rather than a deliberate choice, it loses its grounding. Decisions start to lean on precedent instead of context. The question of why something is risky is replaced by whether it feels bold enough. Ford navigated this unevenly. There were moments when the company benefited from its increased confidence. There were also moments when it struggled to distinguish between meaningful risk and performative risk. Those struggles are not visible in the Mustang's origin story, but they trace back to it. The Mustang did not teach Ford that risk was safe. It taught Ford that risk could be survived. That lesson is powerful. It encourages movement. It reduces paralysis. It opens space for change. But it also requires discipline to apply correctly. Surviving risk once does not mean risk has been mastered. It means the organization happened to align conditions, timing, and execution effectively. When that nuance is lost, confidence outpaces judgment. The Mustang's legacy inside Ford was not just a car or a category. It was a shift in how uncertainty was tolerated. That shift changed the company's posture. Risk no longer had to justify itself as rigorously as before. It had precedent, and precedent, in organizational life, is one of the strongest forces there is. The challenge Ford faced next was not whether it could take risks. It was whether it could remember which risks were worth taking and why. Because once risk becomes routine, it stops being examined. And when it stops being examined, it becomes something else entirely. Not courage, but habit. That is the quiet turning point. And it set the stage for what Ford would remember about the Mustang and what it would quietly forget. Part 7. What Ford remembered and what it forgot. By the time the Mustang story settled into history, much of the uncertainty that shaped it had disappeared. What remained was a clean narrative. Ford saw a gap. Ford took a risk. Ford was rewarded. The car became iconic. The decision was vindicated. That version is not wrong. It is incomplete. What Ford remembered most clearly was the outcome. The sales numbers. The cultural impact. The proof that the company could still matter beyond its existing base. What it remembered less clearly was how close the decision came to going another way. How uncomfortable the arguments were. How many reasonable people believed the risk was unnecessary. How long doubt persisted even after success began. Those details faded because they were inconvenient. They complicated the story. They made the outcome feel less inevitable. They reminded the organization that success had not arrived through certainty, but through a willingness to move without it. Organizations tend to preserve what reinforces confidence and discard what introduces ambiguity. Over time, the Mustang became evidence of instinct rather than experimentation, of foresight rather than adaptation, of bold leadership rather than managed uncertainty. That reframing had consequences. It made the decision look cleaner than it was. It made the risk feel smaller than it had been. It allowed later stories to borrow the Mustang's success without carrying its discipline. The real lesson of the Mustang was not that risk should be embraced. It was that risk should be understood. The decision worked because it was bounded, because expectations were managed, because Ford did not confuse aspiration with capability, because the company remained willing to adjust as reality revealed itself. Those conditions are harder to celebrate than bravery. They do not make for simple origin myths, and so they were gradually set aside. What Ford forgot was not the doubt itself. It was the value of that doubt, the way skepticism forced clarity, the way hesitation slowed overcommitment, the way uncertainty kept the organization responsive rather than rigid. Forgetting that made future decisions feel easier, sometimes too easy. The Mustang's success taught Ford that it could survive uncertainty. That lesson was true. What it did not teach, but should have, was that uncertainty never stops being dangerous just because it once paid off. That distinction matters far beyond automotive history. Every organization eventually tells stories about its defining moments. Those stories shape how future choices are framed. They determine whether risk is approached with humility or confidence alone. The Mustang story could have preserved its tension. It could have reminded Ford that success arrived not through certainty, but through careful movement under uncertainty. Instead, much of that tension was smoothed away. What remained was inspiration. What was lost was caution. The irony is that the Mustang endured not because Ford was fearless, but because it was careful in ways history rarely highlights. It accepted imperfection. It resisted overpromising. It adjusted rather than doubled down. Those traits are less visible than boldness, but they are more durable. The danger of forgetting why something was risky is not that an organization becomes timid. It is that it becomes overconfident. The Mustang did not eliminate risk from Ford's future. It changed how Ford talked about it. And that shift matters, because the next time a company faces a decision that feels unnecessary but persistent, history will not replay the doubt. It will replay the victory. Whether that memory leads to wisdom or repetition depends on what is remembered honestly. The Mustang is remembered as an icon. It is more useful to remember it as a moment when a company chose to move forward without certainty and survived by staying attentive rather than assured. That is the part of the story worth carrying forward. Not that the risk worked, but that it was never as simple as the story that followed. Part 8. What the risk left behind. Risk does not disappear when it works. It disappears when we stop remembering why it mattered. The Mustang did not succeed because Ford abandoned discipline. It succeeded because the company accepted uncertainty without pretending it was certainty. That distinction is easy to lose. History prefers stories where boldness is rewarded and doubt looks foolish. Organizations prefer lessons that feel repeatable. Neither leaves much room for the discomfort that actually shaped the outcome. The Mustang was not a proof that risk is safe. It was proof that risk can be survived when it is bounded, examined, and respected. What Ford remembered was the victory. What it nearly forgot was the hesitation that kept the decision honest. That forgetting is where future mistakes are usually born. The most important lesson of the Mustang is not that it worked. It is that it almost did not. And that the space between those two truths is where real judgment lives. Subscribe to Classic Wheels and Tales for long-form stories about the cars, the people, and the decisions that shaped automotive history. Each episode examines a moment where success was not inevitable and why that matters more than the outcome.